I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Sofie Valk. She is a neuroscientist and director of the Cognitive Neurogenetics Lab at the Max Planck Institute for Human, Cognitive, and Brain Sciences, where she studies the interplay of genetic factors and social behavior on brain structure. Sofie, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Happy to chat about nature and nurture and the brain and whatever questions you may have or
I'm excited as well. So it seems like your lab's focus does really touch on both of those two topics. You've got the nature on the genetic side, and you've got the nurture on the looking at social influences on brain development.
Yeah, I guess that's exactly also what I try to understand. Like on the one hand, how, like, what is the scaffold that we get from biology, like the basis sort of that makes us produce behavior and perceive the outside world, versus how does the outside world beyond our brain further shape and mold it to, like, across our lives. So yeah, nature and nurture, and I think these two things are very intertwined and also very hard to completely see separate. So like I do I think it's a question with a lot of nuances, but ultimately I really wonder about like what is brain structure and how does it relate to our behavior. And I think part of that is also like its ability to change and our human ability to change.
Absolutely. Did you come more from the biological side and then gradually became more interested in human behavior, or did you come from the psychology side and gradually became more interested in neurogenetics?
Neither, I guess. I studied interdisciplinary sciences because I never knew what I wanted to do, because I have a broad interest in a lot of things. Like already in high school, I liked to translate Greek from
Wow.
like in Holland, like I'm Dutch. You also have classic languages, so I really liked like the Odyssey or like Aeneas, which is Latin. But I also liked mathematics a lot and biology and sports, and like there was never something that I was not at least a little bit interested in. I also like these general knowledge quizzes. So then I also was doing rowing at that time a lot, and then I went more to interdisciplinary studies, just to know, to ask big questions and to consider like complex questions within society, and how to like look at them from different like from as the sciences, but also more the soft sciences. And then I guess I didn't study that hard, but then I did like a philosophy, but I found it super difficult to really not only read opinions of Aristotle or Rawls, like also going more in social political philosophy. So yeah, I did finish that, but I found it hard to have my own thoughts and feel that they were meaningful. And then I also studied artificial intelligence as a second major in my bachelor.
Wow.
I found it also interesting, but also super hard to code like how robots should play chess. And then I did a master's in cognitive science, where I found it really hard to understand all these concepts that come from psychology. And it took me like 8 months to understand saliency and what it could mean. Like to me, it was just a word, but I couldn't. And then I started my PhD, where I combined like my interest in social elements broadly with my interest to code and neuroscience. So I guess I always played in two fields and like sort of grooved with it. So yeah.
You sound like a true cognitive scientist in the interdisciplinary sense of the term, because you have like the psychology, neuroscience, biology, the computer science, philosophy angles as well, and they all kind of combine into this one area of studying the mind.
Yeah, I guess that would seem more elegant than saying, yeah, I just did a bunch of things and then
Well, the cool thing about neuro is that it seems flexible enough and broad enough that it can combine all these interests. So like whether you're interested in language or creativity or intelligence or sports ability, like you can always ask the question of, is there something in our brain that makes us better at like whatever this thing is you're looking at?
Yeah, I guess the brain is like also, if you're like computations, like I do like algorithm or like coding too. So like it has a lot of opportunity for different types of questions and different ways to fill up your day with experiments. So yeah, in that sense, neuroscience is a nice place to be situated in terms of interdisciplinary thinking and day-to-day tasks, and also the bigger questions that come with it.
What
so,
did
yeah.
your PhD look like?
A lot of staring out of the window, considering other options, I guess, like, yeah, I guess I learned a lot. Like I didn't even understand the difference between posterior and anterior, despite having a background in Latin. So I really was not a neuroscientist in the beginning. Yeah, I guess I had a plan to come look at like how theory of mind and empathy relate to brain structure, and was very happy to work there with Boris Bernhard, and together we then slowly worked on these projects and tried to figure it out. But only like at the end I understood the road that I had been taking. Like along the way, I was often a bit like, okay, is this working? Like, what am I doing here? Like, what have I learned? And I guess then I also got a child during my PhD, and so at that point it also became important for me to prove that I would finish it nonetheless, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was I don't know, a wild ride in some respect, but yeah, I kind of.
It seems like there's these perceptions of neuroscience being this integrated thing, but oftentimes the stuff you're learning and the research you're actually doing could be very different. One of my very first podcasts was with my current advisor, Megan Herting, and we work on the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study in the US that you might be familiar with. So it's like a lot of big data stuff. So it's basically data science. So you have to learn how to code, but you don't really have to memorize like what the brain actually looks like, or these terms like posterior, anterior. So we were talking about like, how well can you actually visualize a brain? And the answer seemed to be not that well, but we don't need to do that for coding because we can just generate the images and it'll do it automatically.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to some extent, like also like in my PhD, I did acquire also a lot of data for a study with a mental training, which was a longitudinal study. So I spent a lot of time in the basement in the scanner with the support there that we had. And yeah, I also did a lot of, my PhD was also with cortical thickness as the main measure. So I did a lot of manual corrections for at least 1,000 brains, I guess. And then also with the Abide data set, where I also did quality control and manual corrections for another 200 to 300 brains. So there was a lot of, like, I spent at least 2 years in my PhD doing this. And it was nice in a way. It was a bit monotonous, but I really learned good QC skills with my eyes. But yeah, there was a lot of manual labor in that sense in my PhD. Like,
were you looking at cortical thickness for its own sake as an outcome, or were you looking at it in relation to some behavior or some cognitive aspect?
So I think in three of my studies, I looked at cortical thickness and correlated this with empathy individual differences in behavioral scores, and also theory of mind individual differences, and also compare autism to controls in 2 studies, and also one study with metacognition, where we also looked at pericortical FA, which is a sort of surface-based measure of microstructure. And then in the last study of my PhD, we looked at training effects, so longitudinal effects of different types of social mental training and how this may alter cortical thickness. And to further validate, we also compare this maybe to VBM or also DBM, so deformation-based morphometry, to be like a little bit more confident about changes in cortical thickness, like whether this is like how this would look.
Those are all very exciting topics to me as a fellow social neuroscientist. What did you find? Were there associations between all of these?
I guess I found that like it was a different time back then, right? So the study was like 150 individuals about. So what I found is that theory of mind and empathy modulate different covariance networks. So empathy is more related to ventral attention saliency network centered in the anterior insula, whereas theory of mind is more related to default mode regions, including MPSC and TPJ, in their structure in multiple studies. And we found also differences, especially in theory of mind regions in autism. And then we found this effect of alexithymia, which is this ability to describe your own emotions and feelings. And this is often also comorbid with autism, but this actually goes more into this empathy, social affective, social emotional component relating to ventral attention networks. So we found that these two networks, ventral attention networks and theory of mind network, default mode network, would relate, like are related also to different behaviors, and also that these change to some extent differently in the brain when you train these different features. So whether you train perspective taking, so theory of mind, it changes different parts of the brain than if you train social affective skills such as empathy and compassion. So I guess that's what I found, that social neuroscience is like both emotions and cognition, and that this relates to different parts of the brain, so to say.
That's very interesting. That's almost the opposite of what I would expect, because I tend to think of empathy as kind of like this passive process where it's maybe just a trait and you observe people and automatically you might empathize with them. And then theory of mind, I think, is this more active social cognitive process. So I would have thought that maybe empathy would be default mode, because that's like, you know, background processing, and then theory of mind would be more active. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think, yeah, one could think that, obviously, like you think
I mean,
that.
obviously it doesn't fit with the data, so I'm
No,
wondering what do you
no.
think about it
Yeah, I
that
think
reverses that expectation?
yeah, theory of mind is more related also to memory processes and to abstract thinking, which would be more default mode processing, right? So it's also common to like find this cognitive version of theory of mind, like theory of mind. There's also this more effective theory of mind, which relates maybe a little bit to different regions, but at least the theory of mind that we measured was about this cognitive perspective taking on other people, and this would relate indeed to default processes more about, yeah, as I said, memory, self-reference, metacognition, thinking about your thoughts. Whereas the empathy measure that we measured was about like, how do you feel about others? And this is like more also maybe related to interoceptive processes, bodily signals. But yeah, it's easy to reverse inference there. And I think like these features are really very, very complex. And also other studies have shown also like how intertwined they are with each other, right? So in some level, although they can be separated, and that was also like the aim of to show in my studies, like other studies have also shown that there's an interaction between both in real life social settings. So
yeah, maybe we could talk more broadly about the difference between the two, because I tend to think something like animals, especially mammals, that live in social groups and that care for one another, can empathize, but they might not necessarily have theory of mind. Well, I guess the more intelligent you get, the more you start to see something that looks like theory of mind. But is it? So I tend to think of empathy as more emotional and theory of mind as more cognitive. But you're suggesting that both have both.
Yeah, yes and no. Like the tricky thing is also like what is the process that you name theory of mind? And there's also forms like people speak about cognitive and affective empathy. So it's also at some level of word game, right? That makes it also very hard. And I think, especially speaking about cross-species work, it's very hard to say. And I think there is like this human-centric vision, like idea of how what one expect, but it's like also, at least in my understanding, also relatively obvious if I don't know, whales have a different, like we wouldn't know if whales have theory of mind, right? And like if we look through our human glasses to such phenomena, it's quite tricky, but like more and more research does show that also some mammals, maybe not all, but like at different levels have different features that we would associate with social processes, right? Such as grief or like pair bonding, like, so it's really, really complex. And it's also hard to like, I don't know, like if you look at developmental studies, like often it says that this emotional contagion is already present in babies, whereas theory of mind develops between 3 to 5 years of age. But then there are like maybe precursors of theory of mind, like such as joint attention, to look at something that you're looking at and to share that, right? And like all these things do interrelate at some level, but yeah, that's not what I did my PhD about, or like I wrote my thesis about, also the background, obviously, but like it's also, yeah, I think a lot of uncharted territory that's also like hard to measure.
Do you tend to think of these social cognitive processes as like mechanistic, in the sense that, you know, a computer could do it as long as it had enough information? Or do you think there's something more going on that's like I don't know, just more uniquely human, I suppose?
Hard question. Like, I think in theory, like if a computer had a body, maybe if a computer was a robot perfectly similar to a human, and rather than the brain, it had a computer. Yeah, I think there's more to it than only, or I don't know, like at some level, obviously it is a computation that happens in the brain, but it's also something that is happened in an embodied brain, like speaking with other bodies, right? And or at least there is a sense and a smell, like there's other things to it than only the thoughts. And there's also this experience that you had. So maybe if a computer lived for 20 years or for 3 to 5 years, they've also built up this ability to do theory of mind. But I think it's very tricky, and it also depends on like how you define certain things, and then it becomes more a linguistic choice. Then yeah, so I don't know.
Do you think your philosophical training shaped your thinking there in terms of thinking more about embodiment and these sort of limitations to artificial intelligence?
I'm a very humble philosopher, if at all. So I don't know. Like I think I don't know. I think I always try to think critical and also see the limitations of the system and read up on all these things a little bit, at least superficially. So yeah, to some level, yeah, it has my interest to think about what to me these things mean. But I'm not more than an amateur, right? So I don't know. It's not
So
probably yeah.
So during your PhD, you weren't doing genetics research yet. That came later.
Yeah, during my postdoc, and I worked in my postdoc with Simon Eickhoff, and there he wanted me to work on heritability and genetic correlation, also based on my work with structural covariance and how this relates then to individual differences and also in disorder. So yeah, I started doing that with twin data of the HCP data. So it is genetics, but it's not like running a GWAS. So at some level, it's still kind of yeah, I don't know, not so fancy maybe even. So yeah, I learned that during my postdoc and started also after my PhD, I also started wondering why are then these networks where there are in the brain? Like it seemed so obvious, but it's also so weird that these different behaviors relate to different parts of the brain, and how did they end up there, and why do they develop differently? Why can I dissociate them in disorder and behavior? So also coming from this question of why, I think that genetics or like these analysis that I then did during my postdoc could help me answer some of these questions, like why is then the brain organized the way it is, and why is this the case?
Right. So I guess if you believed in like a purely blank slate theory, you might say neurons that fire together, wire together, and you start to assemble these networks just based on the specialization that would inevitably emerge from experience. But that isn't the case. It seems like we come into the world hardwired with certain networks, or at least, right?
Yeah, I think to some extent, at least, there's also a brain in babies before they're born, and it's developed there, and there's also an environment there experiencing things. But yes, and to some extent, there is obviously a genetic program, at least setting up some form of scaffold from which then a brain organization can emerge, given all the settings are sort of right or within a certain limit.
Right. So at the broadest level, we at least have our genes telling us, like which cells should become brain cells and which cells should differentiate to other parts of the body, and that all happens in the womb.
Yeah, and I think also like one question is like when what is left in the brain to self-organize and develop versus what is hardwired, because it cannot be that every connection is hardwired, right? So
right.
And I think that is also still not known yet to what extent, like, yes, cells that fire together wire together, and there's some like element of this, but there's also this at some point in development, likely before one is born and continuing, there's this like more or less hardwired scaffold that the visual regions get a certain position, and also sensory motor regions, like that some anchors at least have a certain position, and then further refinement occurs, so to say.
Right.
Also based on
Does your
experience.
work do like entire lifespan development, or do you focus on a specific age period?
I guess I'm co-author on papers that do the whole like from beginning to the end, so to say. But most of my work in the last years I've worked with human connectome project data for the main question, and that's like 22 to 37. And like in my PhD, it was also like adults. Like I don't have a particular, like myself, not done aging. I see now the members of my lab, they also are interested in neurodevelopment and like puberty, like ABCD data. Like it's also pandemic driven in part. So a lot of open data sets also have a lot of good data on this phase. And I think thinking about neurodevelopmental conditions, it's also obvious to look at the first 20 years of life. But yeah, I don't have a specific, I think, yeah, there's many phases of life that are worth investigating to understand these relationships, right? So,
so what does it actually look like when you're looking for genetic factors, either on brain development or on behavior or cognition?
In terms of like, yeah, like genetic factors is also like rather underspecified term. Like sometimes it works well in an abstract maybe, but or like usually ultimately in my work, it's often heritability or correlation with transcriptomic expression using other open data. So yeah, what I did in one study was, for example, looked at social covariance and then decomposed it into a genetic correlation matrix to see what regions correlate together, show a genetic correlation with each other, and how this is organized along different axes. And then like in another study, I looked if personality and brain structure have a genetic correlation, because both personality is heritable and also brain structure. So I wondered, like, what is the intersection there? Like if this correlation between personality and brain structure is like at least driven by shared genetic factors, or like has a genetic correlation. However, there I also soon figured out that if I then looked at another data set at just a normal correlation, it was not always that the same regions would correlate with the same personality subtrait. So that made it also very tricky to draw any hard conclusions on many things.
So when you say genetic correlation, is it like correlations with particular genes, or is it like comparing, let's say, twins and non-twin siblings and then seeing the genetic difference between those two pairs? Or
yeah, so in effect you do you create a model where you look at genetic proximity, so monozygotic versus dizygotic twins versus unrelated individuals, and you look at how the correlation structure is stronger in people as a function of their genetic proximity. And you can also use structural equation modeling for that to figure out latent factors to get at this overlap, so to say, to understand.
Are you always doing that categorically? So like you could have complete strangers, and then maybe you could have like cousins, siblings, twins. So it's these categorical groups of increasing genetic similarity, or would it be a continuous variable where you're actually like sequencing the genome and then measuring from like completely dissimilar to complete overlap?
So yes, the latter is possible, and I think there's also like other data that is not that open or not open that has a better family structure, so that you also have cousins and 1/8. And like the data set that I've used primarily, or like the only twin data set that also was available to me at the time that I did these studies, was the ACP data set, where you have only monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and also some brothers and sisters and unrelated individuals. So that was a fairly simple model, but like with ABCD, for example, you can also compute this heritability using GWAS. I just haven't done that so far.
So one interesting thing that continues to shock me every time I talk about it is that the genetic similarities between twins, or between people in general, I guess, children and parents or whoever you're looking at, tend to increase over time rather than decrease. And the traditional view would be over time you get socialized more and your environment plays a bigger role, so that you would think the genetic contribution peaks in childhood and then goes down, but the opposite happens, and that seems to be related to like this gene environment interaction. So
Yeah, I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I am a parent, so I know my kids, and like looking at how their behavior varies from day to day. Like I think there's also a lot of other complexities that make it hard to like filter out the true traits that you're after, right? So, and I think maybe with time that also gets clearer. And I do also think that actually early lifetime environment also plays a very important role. And maybe like,
Right.
yeah.
And as a parent, you're not going to be static. If you're a good parent, you're going to observe those individual differences, even if they're small. And then you're in some sense, you're going to magnify them because you might slightly differ your parenting strategy with each child.
I don't have a strategy as a parent. I just try to be nice and patient, but like, you know, yeah, I try to, like, obviously, as with different people, I like, they're different ages, so I interacted with them differently. But yeah, I don't know, I don't have, but you're right that obviously based on like how one acts, that will have an influence is how the environment interacts, like generally with a young individual that is a child, and maybe like at later stages. But yeah, I do remember the study that you talk about, and but like the details are hazy at the moment. So I also wondered like what they said about like what is also like how to see this also across the lifespan. Like, is it maybe then like if you're like 20, like relatively high, but what happens like after 40 and 50, for example? Like, I don't know.
Right.
I
That
suppose
seems
there's
related
studies.
to this idea of like critical periods or sensitive periods. So there's going to be certain age periods where you're more influenced by the environment or less. And then especially in early childhood, you have many of those sensitive periods, like for language development or for sensory development, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think yes and no. It's very tricky. Like, I think a lot of big conclusions warrant further investigations, and like critical periods in humans like are like also a bit tricky, right? And it's like often multiple factors interacting with, for example, language development, which is also motor skill, right? The mouth and the tongue muscles also need to like develop, and like there are some parenting portals that would say, yeah, you should communicate with your kid with signing, because then they can express their needs earlier, because they may not be able to speak, but they can sign that they want more food or they want to sleep. Or so yeah, I think that is also like beyond, like, I'm a parent, but I'm not an expert on children because of that. So it's also like tricky.
Do you think your research has influenced the way you parent, though, or even just the way you look at children in general?
Well, I tell them they should sleep more because it's good for their brain, but
Have you done any research on sleep, or is this just from reading and learning things?
No, I've done one study on sleep, also on sleep duration and brain structure and genetic correlation. But yeah, I think in general, I guess my job is a topic that we talk about. So I guess they know quite more things about the brain than I knew at their age. So yeah, obviously, yeah, and now also my job, like managing a lab, but like obviously that has influenced how I.
Do you know if there are individual differences in the amount of sleep you need? Because obviously some people sleep more than others, but there are some people who seem like they need 10 hours a day. And if they don't get 10 hours, then they're not going to be happy. And then there are other people who might get 5 hours and feel fully refreshed, and they're constantly sleeping 5 hours a day, but don't seem to suffer for it.
Yeah, I think there's huge individual differences there, and also maybe differences of different phases. Like some people maybe need more sleep during certain, like during winter, or I don't know, not that they're
or during
hibernating.
adolescence.
Yeah, or like also when you age, like I don't know, elderly people usually sleep a little bit less, so like, and younger people more. So yeah, obviously there's both within individual as well as across individual differences.
Do we know any of the reasons for that, whether developmental or evolutionary?
Yeah, I think no. I think it's like, yeah, there's probably reasons for it. And I think like more and more is figuring out also about like sleep as this commonality across like all living beings. And like I once also read, like, even, I don't know what was bacteria or something, but even they have these moments of rest, like even if they're like super simple. So it seems to be something that is really essential about being alive to sometimes sleep a little bit. But yeah.
Do you do any work on epigenetics?
No.
No.
I
Okay,
haven't.
we can skip that topic then. Yeah, so we have a few minutes left. What are you currently working on and plans for future research?
I'm currently working on making sure my PhDs are happy, or like that their program and the work that they do is on safe rails. So I'm trying to support them and mentor them. And yeah, I'm also trying to wrap up still some projects for my PhD, understanding like longitudinal effects of mental health training on brain structure and function. And yeah, I'm also more and more thinking about layers and what they mean for brain anatomy and how the brain is actually functioning, and trying to set up a study on this rather than use open data to also be at the scanner maybe a little bit in the next year.
What do you mean by
So
layers? So not just
like
like regions that are separated and specialized, but you mean like actual physical layers?
yeah, like seven Tesla measurements, and then looking at like whether it's more superficial or deeper layers that may be related to a certain process, also to further decompose specificity there in terms of functions. So yeah, I think that is the next frontier, right? Like it's not only a spatial thing that makes regions different just where they are on the cortex, but also like looking at the depth is also, at least to me,
yeah,
I don't know, I think it's fun and a new challenge. And I think part of how the brain is, right? The cortex is a layered structure, and there's variations of that depending on where you look. So
right, especially in functional research, because it seems like the earlier you go, the more likely we are to sort of just say, you know, some broad structure, like the hippocampus was activated, but then obviously that's a big structure. So it's like which portion of it, and then I guess you need the more high-powered imaging techniques, and then also looking at these things like depth and stuff might be the next step.
I think the devil is in the details, right? And I think there, to really understand like what is then nature and nurture, and how these two really broad concepts, what they actually represent, and like how they relate into cognition and also mental health, is, I think, something I'm curious about and want to figure out more about. And especially there also in the context of social environment, like why is it important at all? Like how does this interrelate with the scaffold that we have, so to say, and what is the scaffold then to start off with? So these are like all questions that I have. But,
so how are you operationalizing social environment? What variables are you looking at?
Yeah, at the moment, it depends a little bit like on the study. So with ABCD, there is also some like socioeconomic status, like other variables about parenting elements. So like it depends, like a lot of projects in the lab are currently open data, and then you have to see what fits, like, and also to see how far one can stretch it. So yeah, that's also something that I need to think about in the next couple of years, like how do I want to like operationalize this when I would do my own study? Like what is a good decision there? Because it's like rather complex, right? So
yeah, that's exciting. It sounds like we have some overlap of interest, especially working with the ABCD and HCPD data. So maybe we'll collaborate at some point.
Yeah, drop me a line. Happy to hear more. And yeah, I think many people in neuroscience work with these data sets at the moment. So I think it's it's a really like lovely time to do this kind of research with all the resources and trying to figure out what is going on. But like every data set comes with its pros and cons, and there's a lot of mystery. And I don't know, being humble about what we understand is, I think, also an important goal. And
absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Sofie.
Yeah, thank you for the questions and inviting me. And thank you for the nice chat.